Like, I think sometimes there's a lot of books that we get, that we read from poets that are like, oh, you have a 4-year degree. Oh, you have a doctorate. Oh, you have this education. Oh, you're minoring in that. Like, and you just see that language pop up when you're like, you know, why is crepuscular in this poem about olives? Like, you know what I mean? So, like, I think about language and how I wanted this book to be a book that my mother would enjoy reading, not that my contemporaries would enjoy reading. I mean, it's cool that they do.
Matthew, first of all, thank you very much for participating in the Poetry.LA interview series. You are a poet, you are a poetry slam champion, and you are also an educator. You worked in detention centers in the juvenile justice system in Los Angeles. And were you teaching creative writing there, or what was your interaction with the centers?
We were teaching poetry and hip hop as a form of like healing, and mainly like the tagline would be that we would be dealing with the social and emotional aspects of whatever they're learning. So at times they would be like, "We're studying the Industrial Revolution. How do you make this fit with a young person in early 20th century, like 2020? How does the Industrial Revolution relate to you, or how does coming to a different country and colonizing it relate to gentrification in your direct neighborhood, right? So sometimes we would do things like that, but lately a lot of the work has just been like just writing through poetry, and kind of understanding our own emotional state through our own writing.
How long have you been doing this?
So I started teaching in detention facilities in 2009. In Little Rock, Arkansas, and Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in Jacksonville, Florida, and Richmond, Virginia, just in various places where I was on tour or visiting. But when I moved to Los Angeles back in 2013, it's pretty much right when I jumped into doing a lot of this work.
How did that experience shape your own writing?
Fundamentally, for sure. You know, I think as a human on the planet, like, we have imposter syndrome that we deal with. For sure myself, which is like, who cares about anything that I write? Why would anyone want to read anything I have to say? And it was this intersection between losing my mother, who was, you know, one of my biggest inspirations and closest friends and confidants, and still doing this very intense, emotionally laboring work with incarcerated youth who are often dealing with loss and trauma themselves. And so for me, I was like, look, I'm in a process where I'm away from my family. I've lost someone who's far away from me. A lot of the young people will relate to it by being away from their family. And so we would sit and write together. And, you know, it's an old teaching technique that it's like, all right, here's your workshop. I'm writing. Don't ask me questions. Leave me alone, you know, and where they get a chance to focus on their own work. And so pretty much majority of the book 3032 was written in classrooms with my students. And so a lot of those poems were based off workshops that we were literally giving.
I would like you to read, if you don't mind, the poem. It's called For Any Challenger. It's in your book, book 3032.
This is a great poem to start with because this was where a majority of this book was written, which was in the Challenger Juvenile Detention Facility. Last week, 2 of my favorite students wrapped their knuckles around each other. In class, when we're aggravated or angry, we do push-ups or listen to really cool beats. The other day on my sign-in sheets, in the comment section usually reserved for the principal, one of my boys wrote, "Great class." At the Challenger Memorial Juvenile Detention Center, a youth prison named after a space shuttle that exploded, a failed mission. There is a dog pound in the front gates. You can hear whining and barking as your tires roll through gravel in the yard. You can see the lights from the state penitentiary directly behind. Most of my boys joke and say that this will be their next step, but in my class, I show them poems. Always the powerful and always my favorite. I tell them there is a future in words. I show them my past, the dirt I crawled through, the voice I stumbled on, the same voice we can find searching the right conversations. We speak of memories, acknowledge and agree that we are the sum of what we recall. Their growth is my process, and I love to watch them blossom. Each poem, a petal forcing its way from a bud, a little more assured each time, each step, a little more confidence. I don't teach kids to write poems. I teach them to walk in their own skin. I teach them to own their skin when they walk. Sometimes I stand in front of a classroom and my students look like abandoned homes in the neighborhood the city has forgotten. I give them notebooks. I give them tool belts and talk them into believing anyone can be a carpenter. These words are nails and boards. These poems are houses. Build them carefully. Someone might need to live here. I tell them the sentences you need to focus on don't end with a gavel, but with a period. Let me show you how to make them with your own hands. Your story is important, so write it down. And they do. Some laugh, some cry. I say it's okay. Our emotions are like lightning bugs. If we keep them bottled, they will die. And a person who doesn't feel is just a photograph. I tell them to dream, then edits. Feel for your truth like a switchman engulfed in all life's dark. This universe loves honesty, so don't hold your tongue or your punches. You can be great. Each poem, a petal forcing its way from a bud. A little more assured each time, each step. A little more confident than the last. I tell them I love them because most of the time they never hear that. I tell them no matter what their POs have told them, no matter what the world has shown them, that they are not a failed mission to me.
You mentioned before that you moved from Florida to Los Angeles in 2013, is that right?
Yeah.
And what was the reason of coming to Los Angeles?
Chasing a dream, man. No, I had been bouncing around between my own nonprofit that I started in Jacksonville, and then I moved to Richmond and coached and worked with a youth poetry team and an adult poetry team in Richmond. And my whole idea was like, I want to go to a place that maybe has a budget that could pay me to do the work that I am doing for free. And so then I moved to Leeds, England, and I was in England for about 5.5 months, working with a nonprofit, coaching their teams out there. And all of them was having some pretty decent success at, actually, and essentially caught the eye of a nonprofit here in Los Angeles called Get Lit. And they hired me to be their manager of arts education for their nonprofit for a couple years. And I coached their youth team at Brave New Voices. We were able to go, that team was performed at the White House for Michelle Obama. That team performed with John Legend at the Hollywood Bowl.
And somewhere in America, there's a child sitting at his mother's computer reading the homepage of the KKK's website.
It kind of just kept rolling from there. So pretty much after that first year, just had a really good relationship with a lot of young poets and organizations.
So you were talking about moving a lot, like you were born in Florida, you move around, and you were in England. And I would like to you to reflect on this idea of this movement and your own awareness of your own culture or your own hybrid culture.
Yeah, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and I'm sure you can assume that there's just like not a lot of people that look like me from Jacksonville, Florida. Like you're usually one or the other, and I'm half Cuban, but I'm also Palestinian, Mayan, Jamaican. My mother was a Black woman, so I have so much culture within me, and never really fully understood that until you leave the city. I know that in Jacksonville, I was kind of this anomaly. And even moving to LA, there was this moment where I was like, man, I wanted to accept more of my own culture, but I necessarily wasn't raised in the type of Latinx culture that's on the West Coast versus the type of Latinx culture that's, in Jacksonville, Florida. So even then I felt foreign. So I think, for me, I love coming to LA and seeing this really beautiful melting pot that I just did not get to experience growing up. And I imagine like what my life would be if I'd have been around that. But it's always just been whoever resonates with my energy or who I am, that's who I drift towards. And I wanted to understand more about myself, but I think in coming here, it made me just more comfortable with being who I am and not knowing.
Do you mind reading the poem? It's also in your book, 3032, became a moniker.
If I told you I knew nothing about my culture, would you judge? Ask, why Cuban? If I can't speak to my elders, would you question my heritage? Call me a sellout? Gringo? Ask me to define gringo? See my brown as counterfeit or distraction? Maybe introduce me to the ESL student whose name I'd mispronounce. Assume I'm not the music my grandfather blossomed from. Believe there is no trumpet in my chest. I, a chameleon bleeding into safety, all the broken English glued together, conversations I'll never have with my grandparents, the roots of a family tree I've never seen, embarrassment of yo no sé or un poquito. Still, I am Ivanna's skin, tangle of her hair, the brightest flag my body can wave, uncertainty in everything I am, making me everything I'll never be. Enough to know the tropical my father carries in his bilingual, the steam sweating over my mother's hands while passing heirlooms through her recipes, my diaspora, the Yoruba sitting quietly in my blood, pride that comes with reclaiming of your own name, or just being a mixed boy.
Not a Cult, the publishing house, published your book 3032. You have mentioned that many of the poems were born in these workshops that you did when you were teaching. When did you realize that you had a book in your hands?
You know, the book is like a 4-part love story. You know, it's something that was, yes, dedicated to my students, dedicated to where I come from, you know, dedicated to the home that I grew up in, and also just dedicated to my mother who passed away. My mother passed away in early 2017, and I had been fumbling around with a book for a while before then. And I believe that, like, you know, once that happened, it was like, man, I can't keep playing around, you know. I gotta put this thing out, like, you know, and it was almost like, you know, she never got a chance to see my name on a book. She never got a chance, you know, she never got a chance to read these words. And this book was basically just my healing process of grieving and going through losing someone so close to you. So yeah, it was one of those things that it was like, I just had to do it. And I don't know when it really started formulating into it, but it was like pretty much the moment. I mean, within hours of hearing that my mother was gone, I was like, okay, finish this book.
You have a lot of experience as in the spoken word landscape, of course, and so you and I know poems are poems, but some poems are a little more like stage poems, and some poems are more like a page poem. Do you, when you work on a poem, do you immediately feel, oh, this is more like a stage poem, or is a distinction that is irrelevant for you?
Now in my career, I believe that distinction is like I don't see it, you know, like I'm never writing a poem and be like, ooh, but I should say this word like that, you know what I mean? Like, and I totally know people that do, and like, cool, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's what's up. But not at this point in my career. For sure, early in my career, I was like, I gotta say my poem like this. I gotta make sure that my lines, you know, I'm like, why? It hurts your voice. Why? I just want my words, and to be honest, it's always been like that challenge, like of just like, you know, like I consider like my career, my craft of writing poetry, like probably like a bodybuilder, you know, looks at their body and they look at the parts of their muscles on their body where they're like, oh, I need to do more squats because like I gotta get the bottom of my butt all tight or whatever. I don't know what you do squats for. But like, you know, you look at the aspects of your body that you're like, oh, I gotta work this muscle so that I can get that muscle popping that much stronger. And I think about all that aspect. I think about like, I do want to be a dynamic performer. I want to be a quality writer, and I want both of those things to stand separately and together. So if you pick up my book for the first time, you never heard me perform. I want you to have that same feeling that you would get if I was right there in person, giving you as much energy as possible.
There is a very intense sense of place in your book, and one of the poems that I read several times, the title is Compton, talking about sense of place. And maybe it's because I was an elementary school teacher in Compton for a couple of years. I have that connection with the city. So I would like you to read the poem, and then I have a follow-up question.
I wanted to put a city like Compton, or the name like Compton, in there because, you know, Jacksonville is one of those little like small town cities. Compton is one of those small town cities, but has a big personality, right? Has a big feelings tied to it. Oh, don't go there because that's that. Jacksonville is one of those same cities in a lot of ways. So if I'm being honest, I don't think I'm doing too well. And I don't think I've done much better. I keep telling myself how important my work is, but it's hard to see when a shift ends. A meeting this afternoon, and I feel like I'll be threatened or fired. Not sure if I care, not sure if it matters. My students are not my students. And I am told there is a thin line between what I do and babysitting. I am struggling to oppose the thoughts. Fellow educators look down their nose, question my credibility, jab at the magic I fight to wear. Yesterday, Marvin told me he almost died, told me the bullet that kissed his friend's neck zipped past his own. He writes my lessons. We talk about violence, about childhood, all the feelings we know that only know a clenched jaw. Only visualize the next time to be the end they've been waiting for. This fear is stifling. It tells me the honesty I trudge for is a cloud. Tells me it's out of reach with nothing genuine to actually hold. Yet there are still so many sad questions. Too many questions marked on tongues meant to teach. Too many smart people scaring my students to believe in anything other than death.
In your work in general, and I think this is something that you do very well, besides the language that is very direct and I think is like this are non-apologetic, the way you communicate. But I think in the poems there is this balance between presenting reality with pain, with social injustice, with discrimination, with stereotyping. So you present reality in that kind of complex, but at the same time, you are able to present a certain hope, a certain let's move further. And how do you manage that balance between being truth to reality, but at the same time being hopeful?
Man, I think that's just the person I am, to be honest. Like, I think that's like a lot of like how my mom was. Like, you know, we could like not have lights on, or, you know, like we could be in tough situations. She's like, it's cool, we're just candlelight dinner tonight, you know, like I think there's always a lesson to be learned in every situation. And oh God, that's a hard thing to think of right now in today's situation, in today's environment, for sure. It's hard to be optimistic sometimes, but I try. And I think it's just it's my nature to be comedy relief, even if that comedy relief is to myself. And sometimes it's a cop out, you know, sometimes it's because I'm uncomfortable that I'm like, okay, well, look at that good thing though, you know? But I think in these situations, like I know what it's like growing up in the hood, you know, and I know what it's like, you know, potentially seeing wild or traumatic things by you and not letting it affect you and laughing through that, right? The culture of smile now, cry later. You know, this idea of like, you can't show that vulnerability because it could be dangerous, but also like there's still so much joy in this. You know, like we don't get to go to a water park, but we can open this fire hydrant. And I think specifically for that poem, there's this idea that like, you know, I know that I came from an emotion of like, they had a really like hard ass teacher. And I'm not even sure if I can say it ass, but I said it. I'm sorry. I said it twice now. They had a real tough teacher that was just super strict. And, you know, like he would like, you know, kids would come in and he'd, you know, he'd get a little baton out and metal reader and he'd scan them and like he'd pocket check them and he'd go through their book bags. And Yeah, sometimes they'd have some crazy stuff in there that they would need to be checked for, but it would also just be degrading. And I would see these students come in with a smile, but then be checked with that reality. And I think like even in all that, you have to meet these students where they are sometimes. You know, if I sat there and told a student in there who said, oh, you know, like I was chilling in this car and we got shot at and my friend got shot in the neck and it almost hit me. If I was like, what the hell were you doing in the car, buddy? Like, you know better than that. You know why you know, which would be like the probably responsible response to give him. But instead I'm like listening, I'm like hearing you, and I'm letting you know, like, yeah, I've had similar things like that happen in my life, and I'm an adult now and I see things differently. And I try to model like where you can go. Like, look at me. Like, I'm not perfect. I'm not super smart, but like I've built a life that I'm very, very happy with. And there is happiness out there for you if you work for it.
In Los Angeles, what's your who are the people you read or the people you listen to? What's your like kind of?
Well, my wife is an incredible poet, and honestly, probably my favorite poet, just because of how I feel she approaches poetry and approaches writing. She's also my editor, so it's a good combo.
What's her name?
Alicia Wise Hernandez. She's an incredible poet, published author, really, really great. I'm also a big fan of Tanya Ingram. We're all kind of like an in-house collective almost by proxy, by being so close to each other all the time. So we're constantly bouncing ideas off of. But you know, the community that I really find myself in, that has really like pulled me in, has been this community, Street Poets. Which are just a great organization. This is the organization my wife and I work with here in Los Angeles that teaches in communities and detention facilities. And primarily the work that they do is just so healing based. And I feel like they've really codified the language and the process of poetry being a really healing place. And then I would be super remiss if I did not mention the Poetry Lounge, which has been 100% like the first home I found when I came to Los Angeles. My wife and I mean, we stood in the long lines just to get there, and we sat on the stage and you know, performing at this open mic, which I believe is the largest and longest running weekly open mic in the world, has just been just an incredible blessing. I mean, the artists that come there, Shihan Van Cleef, Jessica Salgado, Edwin Bodney, the list goes on of just incredible artists that are from there and of that and cut from that cloth. It's just really, really dope. And all of those are people that fundamentally push, challenge, and change who I am as a writer and performer.
So this is your time to close the interview. Maybe you can talk about if you have any projects, and of course, we would like you to read one last poem to close the interview.
I dropped the album on my birthday, which was the third project that I did dedicated to my mother. 3032, the book we were talking about, was the first project. Then I dropped an album the same day as I published that book, called Ivanna, named after my mother.
Yeah.
And this project that I just dropped in June was Ivanna II, which was like kind of the continuation of that. And it's all hip hop. It's all on Spotify. Pretty much anywhere where you stream music, you'll find it under my name, Matthew Cuban.
I'm crying while I write the song. When all I want is to belong. I know I might have took too long, but still I'm patient, standing strong. Yeah.
I'll be dropping another book early sometime next year, which is exciting.
Wonderful.
So my second manuscript is up and running. But here's a poem for you, and I really hope y'all dig it. It's kind of an amalgamation of two poems, but it kind of is like a part of my journey through poetry. And so here we go. When I let go, I burst with emotion. I melt into doubt like Wagyu fat on a skillet that I've never had because I'm poor and a poet. When I let go, I lay face to sky and float in a river of joy. A smooth current drifting my life like a paper boat. When I let go, I hold tight to my cherished memories. plucking and pruning the garden of myself, plucking and pruning the garden of all myself, all things once setting me ablaze, now a tame and distant glow. When I let go, maybe I'll be revenant, one who has died yet still lives. And isn't that a garden? A place continuously living while simultaneously dying? Are we not all some private thing to nurture until ripe? Are we not all waiting to soften sweet and fermented, a glass of wine to go perfect with the afterlife? When I let go, reality can become a choice or a chore, and even death can become a blooming when I remember the parts of myself unblemished by fear, the sections untouched and retouched, left alone to rust or mold over. I remember my spirit, a famished optimism, wanting nothing but to be acknowledged and nurtured. All the days that followed held trials like the rays of a sun, spoke consistently of what could be if guilt wasn't carried like a suitcase, if doubt wasn't a second language with no elective, if regret did not hold memories like a jealous lover. I remember every time I said no more, or that's enough, or when will I change, or when will I fall into this cycle like a warm mattress, a bed continuously made for all my indecisions. But I remember her smile, his love, my respect, my responsibility, and all the reasons I cannot allow myself to forget. I'll look back one day and I'll remember the things I chose to leave in the rain, the things I chose to plant and forget, like an unkempt garden of possibility.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you for the interview, and thank you for reading your poems.
Thank you so much, Mariano. You're amazing.